Hey everybody, it's Bookshore, and today I got an important subject matter to talk about, an important book, Rwanda, Death, Despair, and Defiance, by African Rights, which is the conglomerate, who keep tracks on human rights and violations in Africa and, write lengthy documents like this one. Now, a few quick points before I get into the meat of this book. This came out in September of '94, while the massacre happened in April in a 3-month period. So this is right after it had happened, and it contains a lot of personal accounts and names of like the victims and the perpetrators of the massacre as well. Now there is multiple editions of this. There is a revised 1995 edition, which is 1,200 pages. This one is just over 740 pages. So if you want to get the full length document, go for the one that says 1995 on here. I'm going to leave African Rights' website in the description below. I believe it is still active. It says 2021, but I'll leave a little comment down there as well. This book is not widely available, unfortunately. For most stuff I've seen it through, it runs $200 to $300. I got this one for 88, but in African Rights down below, they have it for 50 US dollars. So if that one website still works, definitely buy it through there. Don't buy it through any third party because it's just going to be so expensive. Now, this is just such an important text because it does such a great outline of not only the political causes of how the Rwandan genocide happened, but also it really gets into the humanistic element and the personal accounts of it. And there was just so much sadness in it. This is the most horrific book I've ever read in my life, and nothing can really compare to it. Not only due to the grotesquity of the crimes committed, but also the scale on which it happened, the frequency, and that it's a real life event. In a lot of ways, I had flashbacks to 2666 by Robert Bolaño, not in so much of the detailed graphic nature of the crimes, but how you just keep reading horrible event after horrible event after horrible event, and your mind almost starts to go numb to it. And even though these are such tragic accounts that would define any life in such a huge, monumental way, reading them after one after the other and seeing the systematic ways that these people were murdered, you almost have to keep an active presence of mind to read this and absorb the information. Because I noticed for myself, sometimes it was easy to gloss over some stories, which is not giving proper due care to the victim's story. Now, just a quick backstory of Rwanda before we get back. This was the last major genocide of the 20th century. It took over a 3-month period where 1,000,000 people were killed, 700 of them were Tutsi. It was the Hutus killing the Tutsi in the systematic genocide to erase them. And it wiped out like 70% of the Tutsi population. But it also killed some Hutus and some people of the Twa as well. And now, please forgive me if I pronounce any names wrong. I'm not familiar with the African language whatsoever. This is just my first time actually engaging with Rwandan names. And also, if I kind of skimp on some events or if I gloss over some things, just know there was so much to this. One YouTube video cannot encapsulate it all, and this is a 740-page book, which later came out with 500 extra pages. So for this video, it's not going to encapsulate everything that the book came in. So there might be key details that are very important that I miss, but just know need a lot more research well beyond this book and the revised edition. And this Rwanda and the genocide is such a broad topic, not even one book in itself can encompass everything about it. Now, to first go over the genocide, we first need to start way back when and go over a bit of the history of Rwanda, much like this book does. So, back in pre-colonial times, the Rwanda economy was based into two separate groups, being the Hutu and the Tutsi. Now, this was less based off of race and more based off of economic affiliation. A very basic way to see it is the Tutsi being the supplier and the Hutu being the buyers. So Tutsi had more land, they had more property, and they had the product to sell to the Hutus. Now, these two roles were a lot more interchangeable at the time. A Hutu could become a Tutsi, and a Tutsi can become a Hutu. Now, the book states there really wasn't much conflict between these two groups. I want to look a bit more into that myself, just because whenever humans tend to divide themselves, there tends to be conflict. But for the sake of this video and the fact that I'm just going to be going over the book's content in itself, we'll say that, there was a pretty much amicable relationship between the two. The problem came in when German Belgium settlers came in and they colonized. Now, they went off the theory of the Hamitic race. The Hamitic race being, it's almost like the lost tribe of Israel, where a group of white people deviated from the main European and Anglo-Saxon and Caucasian white people and came to Africa, which later, and this is important, would be kind of identified as Ethiopia. Now, it's a bullcrap theory. There's no basis for it. But colonists used it for their own means, and they said, hey, the Tutsi are more of the Hamitic tribe. They have more features like us. The Hutu are more the Barak tribe, I forget, where it's more like the super African tribe, like just Africans from Africa. Tutsis, you're more from us. Now, there really wasn't a distinction between the two. Like, they did arbitrary things like point at the ridgeline of the nose or height, and this would cause confusion later on in the conflict as well. And it was just a really fallacious way of defining these two groups. And the reason these colonists wanted to do that was because the Tutsi owned the property. They owned the supply. And much like we see in most economic systems, a smaller group of the population generally holds the wealth. So, meaning the Tutsi were propped up into governmental positions through colonization, and it was just a smaller population than the Hutu themselves. Now, after the colonists left, there were years down the road to like the 60s, there was a civil war. President Haya Abimba became president, and there was a shift between the Tutsi and the Hutu in government positions. So now the Hutu had government positions, and the Tutsi were the minority politically. Now, this is where a problem arises because of colonialization, the Hutu were largely left out of a lot of systems, and the divide between the economic divide between the Hutu and Tutsis increased even more so. So now the minority that has usually been more impoverished is in power, and the Tutsi minority, which has a bit more wealth, doesn't have the political power anymore. And this led to a level of extremism that has been festering for a while, where the Hutu are actively against the Tutsi. Now, I say the Tutsi held the wealth, but it was a bit of a misnomer. It's not like a huge divide that we see like during the Great Depression or like in China or anything like that. It might have just, I don't even think the book mainly states there was that giant of a divide, but this led the Hutu extremists to categorize the Tutsi as like, hey, they are ruining us. We are the minority. They are taking the wealth. They have the political power, and they are the majority, even though that's not true. And the Hutu were in majority power at the time. So after that, a civil war between the MRND, which is the Hutu majority party, and the RPF, which is the Tutsi army, and they went to war with each other, and a lot of Tutsi individuals had to leave the country to Uganda and various other countries next to Rwanda. And the RPF had to train those soldiers outside more as well. This is the point where extremism ran rampant in Rwanda, where you had the Rwandan radio kept festering these lies about the Tutsi population and making lies about their own economic status in Rwanda, like how it's overpopulated, there's not enough room. That's why we can't let the Tutsi population back into the country. The book states that its overpopulation is kind of a myth because when you have a large group of people, you're able to create more industry and more resources. It's when you have an underpopulated environment, much like we're seeing in Japan right now, where the economic status of the country tends to decline and becomes more difficult. But a problem that there was with Rwanda due to the poverty is that they had this law where you can go and make any part of land that you want, you can just go and develop it and make your homestead there as long as it's not claimed. The problem for a lot of young men was that a lot of the land that was claimed was in nice environment, and the unclaimed land was in very hilly environments where it was very tough to develop agriculturally. And also on top of that, due to I think some part of government mismanagement, the young men didn't have job opportunities to go to, and they weren't able to get education. So you had a population of young Hutu men, and some Tutsi as well, and some Twa as well, who weren't able to create any economic resources or, get a wife. So they're just there and very angry. So when you have a group of men who don't have the opportunity to go further in the social economic ladder, who don't have the opportunity to create land, and who are largely uneducated and who are listening to extremist ideas, they're very malleable and they become dangerous. Also, there was another group called the Interahamwe, which is a group that would come and build roads, and it was more like a local grassroots Hutu organization. They're important to state right now because they later become radicalized, and they're very different from the Rwandan civil guard or the Rwandan army as well. And just keep note of them. They're going to play a huge part. Now, the president was creating a lot of trouble as well. He released the Batuhu document, which is a racist document going against the Tutsi, really creating the dividing lines between the Tutsi and the Hutus. Again, not based on any real science. This is where a lot of the colonialist racism comes in, because while the colonials separated the two, so Tutsis have more defined noses and are taller, and the Hutu are not. They defined as the Hutu being the real Rwandan, the ones who are actually from Africa, while the Tutsis are from Ethiopia. They are the white invader. So while the Hermetic theory of race favored the Tutsis, the Hutu extremists now flipped that around to favor the Hutus, and they came up with a playbook on how to define Tutsis. Even though, while there was a little bit of stuff where it seems like some Tutsis were taller in a way, both groups are Rwandan, and to identify them in an individual level, it was ridiculous. And you'll see that later, well, a lot of Hutus were killed by accident. Also, the main defining factor between Hutu and Tutsis was lineage. So, and how they did that was you would either be identified as Hutu or Tutsi on ID cards. So that was the biggest indicator of which race you belong to, not so much your physical appearance, even though they went on physical appearance. So it became a bad situation later where if you didn't have your ID card, you were a Tutsi trying to hide your lineage. So the president is spouting all this racist rhetoric. The MRND is promoting that as well. So at this point, the RPF is trying to come back into the country. And just to be a bit fair, the RPF did have child soldiers, so they weren't the best on that level, but as you're going to see later, they're the only ones who were trying to stop the genocide. And so with the RPF trying to come back, and mind you, these are Tutsis trying to invade their own country, because the MRND largely said, like, no, you can't come back, we're overpopulated, we don't need you, made up all these lies, and outside governmental organizations kind of bought that as well, unfortunately. So you have their own people trying to invade to come back, while the Hutu in the country is making all these derogatory remarks towards the Tutsi. Now, outside countries did try to make the Ashura Accords, I think it was Belgium, where it would placate levels between the Hutu and the Tutsis, and the RPF was all for this, and President Harambembe was going to go for that as well. However, at one critical evening, when he's flying his plane and he's about to sign the accords, it gets shot down. A lot of people in Rwanda blame that on the RPF. However, people who were actually aware of it and people keeping track of Rwanda and knew that no way in hell was it the RPF, because they supported the Ashura Accords. It was the MRND who did that, because if Harambembe signed that document, that treaty, they would have to be responsible for a lot of their transgressions, and they didn't want that signed. The president was only doing that from pressure from outside forces, so by taking him out, that document, that treaty was effectively dead. And this is the inciting incident, which the book describes as the start of the apocalypse, which is unfortunately very apt, where once this happened, all hell broke loose, and this is where you get the 3-month genocide and mass rapes of the Tutsi population in Rwanda. Now, some Tutsis in the book state, and I think properly so, and the book states as well, that this is not a tribal warfare. And that's very important to state, because so many outside governmental forces saw this as a tribal warfare. So it's like, okay, it's tribal, it goes back so many years, there's nothing we can do about that, which is not true. This, in a lot of ways, was a political war, and that's not the point the book makes, but some Tutsis in the book do make that point, and I think there's a lot of ground to stand by that, because a lot of moderate Hutu, which is funny. I was watching to see how to pronounce the president's name. They call him a moderate Hutu, but which may or not be true. But we'll get later. Governmental forces handled this horribly, but the MRND killed so many Hutus and Twas who were moderate, some who tried to support the Tutsi. So what they were trying to do is create a political environment of extremism and create a Rwanda of Hutu killers who were all conjoined by the killing of the Tutsi population. And if you didn't want to be a Hutu killer, you were either forced or you were either killed. Now, foreign governments did a very horrible job in mismanaging this. First, Belgium, who was the original colonizers of Rwanda, decided they pulled out. You had a lot of Belgian military men who left refugees begging them not to leave, and some of them just felt horrible about it. But even though they pulled out and they didn't help the people, at least they stopped selling arms to them, which really pissed off the Rwandan government. So even though they weren't complicit in the crimes directly, they also didn't help them as well. But it was still a bad state. France messed up. Like, my friend before this said, like, France has a lot of problems with foreign relations. Like, if you look at the Treaty of Versailles, if it wasn't for France implementing that, Germany wouldn't have gone to Nazism. And, you know, that's true. This one really reaffirmed it. France actively helped the Rwandan government by manning blockades, as we'll see was later is very important. In fact, in some ways, helping soldiers and killing some of the RPF. And which some military men later on said, like, hey, we were kind of duped into this, and France really messed up this situation badly, and they were the ones left in control. So on top of the tribal warfare as well, a lot of people slept on what was happening in Rwanda because, one, the Rwandan government was giving out false information, fake news to other foreign entities, and two, nobody really wanted to admit this because right when that happened was when the apartheid in South Africa was ending. So they didn't want to spoil this great event with this other genocide that was happening. It came to the international attention by a lot of bodies going down the river into other countries, and when they'd see these mass bodies floating down the river, it was impossible to ignore this. Now let's talk a little bit about Rwandan infrastructure. So Rwanda is a mainly Christian nation, or possibly evangelical, and they have a lot of mega churches. So the reason it's important to state that because that was a source of refuge for a lot of people, where they were able to fit tens to 20,000 people in these churches, and they were all across the country. And that's an integral part to the genocide. Two, the communities were a bit smaller, where people knew each other. So as we'll see later, a lot of the victims were able to name the killers. And three, they had mass latrines, and these latrines where you can defecate in to go to the bathroom and whatnot, and that becomes an integral part of the genocide as well. And four, roadblocks. Somebody in the book states that closing off these roadblocks should be as like a violation of like human rights and a war crime. And they absolutely should, because these roadblocks were so imperative for killing so many Tutsi people. So, you know, when you're trying to leave your town to escape the murders that are coming after you, the roadblock would stop them, and they would check your ID, see you Tutsi, pull you aside, and kill you. Now, for the actual method of murder in itself, it was led not so much by the soldiers of Rwanda, by the MRND and the Presidential Guard, it was led by the Interahamwe. And these people were a separate entity, and they did a lot of the killings with machetes. Machetes is a large symbol of genocide in Rwanda. A lot of the armies didn't have enough of the ammunition to mow through people, and even if they did, they used machetes for two purposes: psychological damage to the Tutsi, and to make people have a much more active role in the killing. Because mind you, not all Hutus wanted to kill the Tutsi. That's a very important distinction to make. So even though there was a lot of Hutus who hated Tutsis, the Interahamwe forced people to kill. So rather than taking a gun and killing people and having a more depersonalized event, actively taking that machete and to chop people down, they did that. So once you did that, you couldn't escape from that level of violence that you inflicted on this other person. And now, even if you don't agree with the extremist Hutu ideology, you're now part of it by doing that physical act and having the trauma from there. A lot of these people who were murdered, A lot of the Hutus who murdered Tutsis were public figures. They were neighbors. They were teachers. They were healthcare workers. I think there was one story where doctors were killing patients. Um, so many personal accounts are in this book of Tutsi survivors. Places that should have been safe, like hospitals, still got invaded. Churches still got invaded. A lot of clergymen failed their people because they didn't speak up enough against the extremists. And a lot of priests, they didn't do that because they kind of secretly agreed with the extremist ideology. So in a lot of situations, you had churches filled with tens of thousands of people, and either the soldiers protected them would leave, or the Hutus would just walk in, and they would just start murdering them. They would just start macheting people en masse. And there was one story, they killed people from 7 to 5 p.m. and they said, we'll be back the next day. And you saw this consistently. And there was even plenty of stories in this where Tutsis would beg the Hutus to kill them. Like, just kill me. They just had their family murdered. Everybody they know just got murdered. There's mass dead people all around them. And the Hutus would say, no, we have killed enough today. They got to a point of being tired of killing that even the people that they were going to come kill the next day who would beg to be killed, they're like, no, we're going to hold off. We're tired. Tutsis would pay off Hutus, not as so they won't be exterminated, but also in a horrible thing, Tutsis would pay Hutus to be killed by a bullet because the machete was so horrible to be killed by. Also, remember, if you're wielding machete and chopping down people, it is not an effective way to kill people in mass. Your arm gets tired, the blade gets dull. So you would have a lot of people who would survive the massacre, and they would have cuts all over them. Cuts to the head, cuts to the torso. There was a systematic way that they had to kill these people. And what happened to a lot of them when they get these cuts, they would hide under dead bodies. They would wait, and when they had a chance to escape, they would run to the swamps, they would run to the forest, and they would hide themselves or try to go to a hospital. So many hospitals had people missing limbs, had gashes on the head, gashes on the torso, because there wasn't enough force used to kill these people. There's plenty of stories of people hiding in the ceiling of the house. One man, it was pretty extraordinary. He hid in his home, and eventually he fell down and hit his head, and he eventually said, screw it, I'm not going to wait anymore. And he went out and said, like, kill me, just do it. If you're going to do it, just do it now. And somebody took a shot at him, he missed. Like, you're not even good enough to kill me. And they told him to come out the next day on the streets to kill him. And he came out, and the RPF came, and he was saved. Now, that's an extraordinary story, and such a lucky individual, and quite harrowing. But when you look at it statistically, it is the rare story. The more common story is people just getting mowed down. And the saddest story I read in this book, and one where I just had to stop reading and not look at it, was the story of a mother with her 2 or 3 children, where they were running away. She was pregnant at the time, and while they were trying to escape, she goes into contractions and starts giving birth. So she couldn't go with the escape group. She hides with her children behind a bush and gives birth. The next day, she sees an old woman, a grandma, walking down the street who was Hutu. And she asked her, like, please, can you help me? I just gave birth. I need help. And the grandma looks at the baby, takes a stick, and kills it. Because it was a male child. That's one less Tutsi child to grow up and subjugate my children. And the mom was mad. She just started yelling. It's like, how could you do this? You killed my baby. It was a newborn. How dare you do this? The child was only 10 hours old, and it was already mercilessly killed. And the woman called her adult sons to come over and killed 2 more child. And then they beat the mother with machetes, they beat the daughter, and they threw her in a latrine. The daughter and the mother survived, but imagine, you have these festering wounds, and now you're among all these feces, and they think you're dead, and you're with all these other dead bodies. And because you're in this horrible state, that's the only way you can escape. I had to stop reading. I just couldn't handle this thought. And this person, she has to deal with this trauma the rest of her life. Seeing her children, her young children, die in front of her. And the people who did this were her neighbors. They were Hutus who bought the extremist ideology and saw the Tutsis as such a detriment and a threat to their people that they can kill young children this easily. This is how bad the propaganda was in Rwanda. And while that story is very grim and horrifying, that is the standard with the genocide. The man being able to escape and confronting his killers head on, that is the rarity. So many stories of mothers having to abandon their children, fathers seeing their daughters get killed in front of them. That's the norm. Of people not knowing if their brothers and sisters are dead. Another big part of the massacre, unfortunately, was rape. Rape was used as a tactic to subjugate so many people. And it's this very strange thing that you do see in human history, that you can be racist to a huge group of people, but you still want to be sexually active towards them. Now, there was a few different forms. One, people raped and then killed. Rape just for the sake of rape, just for souls to get their rocks off and to have that satisfaction. Two was to use the Tutsi women as future brides. So while they wanted the Tutsi men dead, because they felt like the Tutsi men from the Civil War, they should have killed them off so they wouldn't have made the RPF stronger, they wanted the women so they can be bride to the sun and eventually have Hutu children. So many women were raped. Thousands, tens of thousands of children were born of war babies in this situation. And a lot of those children have a stigma now and have to grow up. Mind you, remember, this is 1994. These kids, I was born in 91, I'm 29. These kids are younger than me. These kids are age 26. They haven't even hit 30. And also, with these rapes, was the mass spreading of AIDS. AIDS was already a problem in Rwanda. So many soldiers had AIDS, and many soldiers were on multiple women at a time, to the point where not only did they not the father, but they don't even know who they got AIDS from. And so you have a huge population of Rwanda who have AIDS now, and it just spiked because of these rapes. An interesting thing with these rapes was that, one is that with a lot of them who were trying to make them wives, some of the soldiers still try to do convincing with them and talk them into being their wives. There was a level of being amicable with them. A lot of women were forced to do it, unfortunately, and just were forced in that position. But with some of the refugees that you'll see in these rape stories, the captors were still trying to negotiate with them. But I think a great example of how screwed the situation is and how we can't put a Western solution to it in a lot of ways. I'm not saying we can't judge this. We can absolutely judge it, but a lot of the ways that we address rape in this country, we can't even apply in Rwanda. It's because, like one woman said, the man tried to rape her or did rape her in this situation, and he didn't even see it as rape. He saw it as making her his wife. When you have a huge group of the population like that, who may not be held accountable later, who decimated the victim population, and now are in position of control, if they don't see that level of sexual abuse as rape, and they just see it as, this is the way I make this person my wife, you really can't solve that. There's no way to shame these people or to provide an alternate mindset. Mind you, these people are adults. They're the uneducated boys, they're the older men, they're soldiers. Like, you can't change their mindset. There's nothing to hold them accountable to change their mindset. Unfortunately, and I could be wrong about this, but it seems that it just might be one of those things where it's just a generation where they can't be held accountable. And in order to fix it, it just has to die off and go in the future. But unfortunately, these are the fathers of these children. If they even took responsibility now for their children, that mindset is going to be passed on unless there's an outside source who can come in and fix that, which unfortunately there may not be. So what is the international response to this genocide? Awful. They always didn't want to get involved. They didn't want to admit to it in a lot of ways. The UN just was very lackluster. Unfortunately, US was very bad about it also. President Clinton didn't want to call it a genocide, so he called it something to the effect like a huge systematic violation of human rights, which is like the most cop-out loophole wordplay you can play. But the reason he didn't want to call it a genocide, because if they did name it a genocide, the US would have to get involved. And they let France handle the situation mostly, but France has a horrible history with Africa. They still do right now, where a lot of natural resources that are found are claimed underneath the French because they see it as Africa repaying them for building the roads during colonization times. There's a quote in this book where somebody says France doesn't want to get rid of Africa because that's the only way they can stay relevant in the 21st century. And that quote was 40 years old at the time of this book, so it's about 70 years old now. And a large part of the international response was wanting a ceasefire. Now, this was hugely detrimental to the RFP effort to stop the killing. I mean, again, RFP was a Tutsi-based army was reinvading, and they were the ones, when they came, that is what stopped the killing. They're the only people who were actually involved with stopping the Hutu extremist government. But other countries wanted a ceasefire, and even we wanted a ceasefire, and the UN was trying to negotiate. That was hugely detrimental. The reason why? So it would be a ceasefire between the RFP and the MRND, the Hutu soldiers. But the Hutu soldiers weren't the ones exactly doing the killing. It was the Interahamwe. And the Interahamwe were doing the killing. So if there was a ceasefire, it stops the RPF from invading, and it allows the Interahamwe just to go crazy and kill everybody. So nobody had a good response to this. There was so many signs, warnings that were ignored. There's so many people who dragged their feet on the situation because they just saw it as tribal killing. We were more focused on South Africa with the apartheid being taken down in Mandela. And I think we were more focused on that because that was more closer to America, where we can see that as kind of like almost like the freeing of the slaves of that time, black people getting their rights. But they didn't want to admit to this other horrific killing going over there. And when they did make a specialized force to go in there, it was usually undermanned, underfunded, and sent in way too late. So the effects that you get, you have a lot of people, a lot of Tutsi population who were killed off. You have a lot of Hutus who were killed off. You had a lot of the Twa that was killed off as well. And you have an organization, you have a group of people who were not largely held responsible. Now, caveat, this book came out in 1994, like 2 or so months after the genocide stopped. There's a 1995 edition, which might have more information, and there's probably a lot more books on how this was handled afterwards. But at the time of 94, a lot of people were dragging their feet and to do the tribunals to get a lot of the killers to jail. Now, that could have changed afterwards. But at the time, and they were talking about this, they would recognize like, hey, we don't want to put every killer in jail because you pretty much wouldn't have a country anymore. But the people who were the top officials, the local people who forced other Hutus to kill, those should be held accountable. But again, at the time of this book, they weren't being, and that might change later on as well. There's a lot of reading I need to do. Now, some things I wish I could have got more from the book, and it could be in the revised edition. I wish they would have got more into the propaganda, the radio station with Rwanda, and like because I know they use like the equivalent of chick books to portray Tutsi women as like whores and whatnot, and that's what also led to a lot of the rape. So we got a great viewpoint of the victims in this book. I wish we could have got more of the mindset of the Hutu extremists, because it was still tough for me this still seemed like a leap from people being amongst their neighbors to killing the Tutsis. And while I can understand some side of it, I know there was a much more active effort to make this level of extremism by the government. I wish we could have seen that more. So some things I've learned from this book. One is the power of victimhood and the dangers of it. We have a tendency in the West and probably in a lot of other countries to see victimhood as almost this holy state where you can do nothing wrong. My example of that I always like to give is that the trains of Auschwitz. It was a horrible crime. These people were systematically killed, but you can't tell me that every person in that train was a good person. There was probably killers, there's probably rapists on that train, but they get washed out by the overall view of victimhood. Just like with the Tutsi, there's probably bad Tutsis, but that doesn't matter because the systematic injustices imposed on them was much greater than their individual crimes. Now, why do I say that? Because that's how the Hutu categorize themselves. Even though they were the ones in political power, even though the majority population of the country, they placed themselves in that victimhood status that the Tutsi were doing them wrong, and through that, they were able to justify these killings to themselves. And you see that a little bit in the West with some of the ideology we have, where you see that with a lot of the neo-Nazis, even though white people are the largest population in this country, and I know white is a problematic term, and most people who hold government offices are white, and so they're the majority in both sense. Neo-Nazis still try to portray that view of the nationalistic tendencies, and the thing is that we are being hurt, we are being targeted, we are losing our jobs, our population's dying, they're taking us over. It's very the same rhetoric that you see in Rwanda with the Hutus. Now, another thing is that the importance of violence and portraying violence into the educational system. Now, I was a very sensitive kid growing up, but this book wouldn't have had the gravity of it that it does if it didn't show all this horrible, grim violence. And there were some things I readdressed later on when I was reading this book that I realized, like, oh my God, this was so much worse, but we took out the violence and we whitewashed it. An example is the China one-child policy. When I learned about, like, oh, this sucks, they have the one-child policy, this is horrible, I can't believe they did this. But then I didn't know about the killing of babies, the drowning of the doctors, the hounding of the parents when they would be outside. When you take out the violence in situations, you lose the gravity of it as well. So simply, if you teach Rwanda without the violence of the killing and the intimate detail of how the killer did that, you lose the trauma that the victims go through and that they have to live with now. So when we address this, when you address future social injustices, do not take out the violence. Really get in there. It's important to understanding the victim's experience within this. Also, another thing is a Western focus for genocide being the Holocaust. Now, I have Jewish identity. This is not a Holocaust denier thing at all. This is not saying that the Holocaust was horrible. It's not like, oh, it's not that bad. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that when we have such an insular focus on the Holocaust as a genocide, we tend to see it as an aberration rather than something that's systematically happening through human history and even the present day. So the Holocaust is not an aberration. The World War was, but not the Holocaust. Rwanda happened like only a few decades afterwards. Currently, we have the Rohingya and we have the Uyghur genocides happening right now, which apparently a lot of people on the left and socialists like to deny that because they're like China. But we also look at the Mao Revolution. I heard Vice describe it as pro-feminist, which is ridiculous even though Mao killed so many people. We tend to ignore stuff like the Pol Pot genocide as well. So when we just have this insular focus on the Holocaust, and it's not the exception to the rule. It's very common. And right now, how many people can say you're actively thinking about the Rohingyas or the Uyghur population right now? They are just getting decimated. So that's a danger in itself. It's great to learn about these genocides because they are something that's happening consistently, and not even in the context of history, but in the context of the present as well. So Rwanda is a topic I'm going to have to address in the future. I do want to get the other edition, but I'm also going to have to get other books on it. And there is a lot of stuff I've missed. Like, I didn't even talk about Hotel Rwanda and how the person, and even in that, because that was a small part of this book, but that person later, he has, even though he's Hutu and he's a moderate Hutu, he has rhetoric that is clearly in line with the Hutu extremists claiming that the RPF is the ones responsible for the genocide. That was something that happened a lot also, and that's not something I talked about much, but the Hutu population saying the RPF was responsible for the genocide. The French soldiers believed that, and they killed RPF to only realize later, like, oh man, we're on the wrong side here. So there's just so much, the after effects, what happened to the children. Present day Rwanda, I have no idea about that. It is just a topic that you can devote a whole area of study to, and something that I really want to study a lot more as well, but I also want to study other genocides as well. So I implore you, buy this book. Even if you don't read the whole thing, read certain segments of it. Read the political chapters, read the personal accounts. They're very easy to identify throughout the book, and even though they're horrible and they're just the worst levels of humanity, it's important to understand these things, and they shouldn't be shown in the dark. The Rwanda happened because we largely ignored it, and we cannot continue to be ignoring these genocides. To ignore them is to allow them to happen. is to allow the monsters to fester in the darkness. To read about them, to learn about them, to have discussions about them, that is the only way that we can ever hope to have a chance to avoid these situations in the future, at least as a starting point.